Hello everyone, welcome to another bonus lecture. This is for the week on impact evaluation, but also really the week on cost-benefit analysis. So I included as a bonus lecture material a talk that I gave to the Cambridge Union on cost-benefit analysis, specifically in the context of valuing human life, as the bonus lecture for ex-ante evaluation. But we'll also be talking a lot about cost-benefit analysis here. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about falsification, which is the kind of bonus material. I used to have it in the lecture, but I felt like it was maybe a bit tangential to the course. Students didn't really know where to put it, so I've put it here in the bonus material. Then we're going to talk about WELLBYs, wellbeing-adjusted life years, as an example of cost-benefit analysis and impact evaluation and commissioning. And then I'm going to just Google around and give you an example of me doing the assignment task, the Summative 1 task for impact evaluation to show you kind of how I'd go about it. All right, let's crack into it. Let me get my little laser pointer out so that everything's working fine. All right, so the context for falsification is evidence-based policy. So evidence-based policy on the face of it seems great, wonderful. Why would we not want to be evidence-based? What do we mean by evidence-based policy? Well, ostensibly it's about applying the scientific method to policymaking. And the idea is that if we could just make policymaking more scientific, policymaking would be better. I think that's broadly wrong, but there are many ways in which applying science to policymaking would make it better. Unfortunately, we don't really have quite the scope in this course to discuss that in detail. This course kind of prepares you to have that discussion. If we were doing the graduate course with me on wellbeing policy, we'd talk about this in more detail. So let's park all that. What I want to talk about here is what exactly it means to apply the scientific method in policymaking. I think the scientific method is quite poorly understood, even by scientists, or indeed especially by scientists, and especially by economists. So I think economists at the moment have an extremely narrow understanding of what knowledge is, how knowledge can be generated, and what counts as good or bad knowledge. And given the dominance of economics over policymaking, I think this can lead to a lot of bad policymaking. It's not to say that any other discipline has a much better perspective on how these things could be done, but there is a body of literature called evaluation studies, which is not done by economists, or it certainly precedes economic approaches to valuation. And a lot of the way economists think about valuation is in that literature, but that literature is much broader than it. I think that literature does show us a way forward to a better way of evaluating public policy, and I'll talk about a bit in the last slide. What I want to do first is just give you guys a bit more of an explanation about how science works. So a very quick, 5-minute intro to philosophy of science. I think everyone would benefit from learning philosophy of science. If it was up to me, I would have a compulsory course for all undergrads in the humanities and social sciences in the philosophy of social science, at least a couple of weeks. Anyway, most academics, and I think most people in general, think that science is about confirming things, about proving them to be true. And this is where you get this logic in policy studies of what works. So you remember the reading from David Blunkett much earlier in the course, that what academics should be engaged in, according to Blunkett and according to a lot of other academics, is generating evidence about what works. In fact, science is very rarely about confirming things. It's almost impossible to confirm something. Even things that look like confirmation are actually often very far from full confirmation. What we usually do is actually falsify things, show that they don't work the way we believe them to work. And this is very, very valuable. And we should actually think much more in terms of falsification rather than confirmation. And that's because of the problem of induction. So let's talk about that in a bit more detail. We want to distinguish induction from abduction and from deduction. Abduction is a kind of iterative process that's very common to sociology and arguably is very common to even quantitative social science, but let's park that and just distinguish between deduction, which is what you do in math, and induction, which is what we do in empirical work. So work where we are observing the real world and making inferences on that basis. So in mathematics, we do deduction. This is when you logically derive truths from other truths through, say, formal proofs. So let's take a very simple syllogism as an example. So if we say that all four-legged animals are cats, and we take that as a premise, and then we note that Dave has 4 legs, we can infer from these two statements that Dave is a cat. Now, the challenge for deduction is that deduction either proceeds from an axiom, so that's something that you take on assumption. So you might say something like, assume all four-legged animals are cats. We know that all four-legged animals are not cats. There are also dogs, for example, with 4 legs. But we can often take these axioms as a starting premise. So when we did rational choice theory earlier in the course, rational choice theory proceeds from these sorts of axioms to get its deductive engine started. If you don't have axioms, so assumptions that you take as given, you have to start from empirical observations. So I might observe that all cats have 4 legs, or that by default cats have 4 legs, or something like that. I've observed that. That's an empirical observation, and empirical observations have the problem of induction, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So the issue for deduction is that deduction can't get us knowledge about reality on its own. We either need to start from axioms, so these are not realistic, they're not observations about reality, they're assumptions that we make in an abstract mathematical space, or we have to start about empirical observations of reality where we're not relying on deduction, we're relying on induction. So we need empiricism at some point, either to start from reality or to get back to reality. What is this problem of induction that I keep referring to? Let's start with a very pure statement of it, but kind of a silly one. So if you drop an egg on the floor 1,000,000 times, every time you drop it, it breaks. You still don't know for certain that the 1,000,000th and first time you drop that egg on the floor, it won't float to the ceiling. It might just be the case that we haven't observed the full probability distribution, the full statistical distribution of the phenomena in question, which is what happens to eggs when you drop them from some height. Another famous example that's used to explain the problem of induction in philosophy is the conceptual color grue. So we don't know anything that is grue, but it's impossible to know whether something is grue because the way grue works is that it appears green until some date, at which point it turns blue. So it might be the case that things that we observe today that are green are actually grue. We just don't know yet whether they're going to turn blue sometime in the future. Now you might think that both of these examples are like completely farcical and the kind of thing that philosophers can get obsessed with, but we practical people involved in social science and policymaking don't need to bother with stuff. But I think that's not true. So let me give you a real life example that's extremely similar to the notion of grue. So for millennia, thousands of years, Europeans only ever saw white swans. The black swan was a mythical creature, something that only appeared in ballet. Every swan that had been observed in real life was a white swan. So in terms of that syllogism that we had before about Dave being a 4-legged cat, you could say something like all swans are white. And this would be seemingly an empirically validated premise, and you could then work your deductive magic from there to get to some other conclusions, like if Dave is a swan, then you could presume that Dave is white. Then, of course, some intrepid explorers ventured to the far-off lands of Australia, way on the other side of the planet, and all of a sudden they saw black swans. Right? So for thousands of years, for millions of observations of swans, they'd always been white. And now all of a sudden, the 1,000,000th and first observation of a swan, it's black. Another real-life example of this, and one that is the subject of a very, very large literature in probability studies, in financial economics, in finance in general, is tail risk in financial markets. The public intellectual Nassim Taleb kind of made his whole career out of studying these events, which he calls black swan events. So these are very, very rare phenomena. But instead of in a normally distributed phenomenon, by the time you get to like the third or especially the fourth standard deviation, things are just so exquisitely unlikely to happen. Whereas in a fat-tailed distribution like this, tail events are very rare, but not that rare. And when you think about things like financial crises, tail events are actually fairly common. They're just very unpredictable. And so the problem of induction applies very substantially to the study of tail risks in financial markets and tail risks in general with things like bushfires and other kind of natural disasters. And Taleb's work really applies this problem of induction as a kind of key analytical tool to understand these problems. Now, the problem of induction makes confirmation of any empirical truths very tricky. Basically, anything that we want to claim on the basis of a lot of observations, on the basis of statistical analysis, and therefore of probability, is prone to this problem of induction, and we might be wrong. We might just not know yet that we're wrong because we haven't observed enough of the distribution. All right. So how do we get around this? Well, a very influential solution, or something approaching a solution, comes to us from Karl Popper, also very substantially referenced in Nassim Taleb's work, particularly the book The Black Swan. I would say that Karl Popper is perhaps the most criminally understudied great thinker of the 20th century. I happen to have done a lot of Karl Popper as an undergrad because my undergraduate supervisor was Karl Popper's PhD student, but otherwise I've never really seen him appear in any undergraduate curricula, even though he is, I would say, inarguably one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. Most people agree with that. He did a huge amount of work both in the theory of knowledge and in liberal politics. And I would say as a general thing, the 20th century liberals, Popper, Berlin, Russell, Oakeshott to a lesser extent, these people just aren't studied enough. There's so much emphasis on Enlightenment liberals and classical liberals, and then we don't study the 20th century liberals. And this seems to me particularly a blind spot because a lot of the 20th century liberals are much more sophisticated about the like sort of relative roles of government and markets and community in getting better outcomes for humanity than the classical liberals. The classical liberals are working against a much more nefarious state. The 20th century liberals are often working post-World War II in the midst of fascism, communism, other totalitarian doctrines, but also amidst welfare states and other things that governments do really well. And so I find that they tend to be just, much more sophisticated about those themes than a lot of the classical liberals who are dealing with different things like developing the idea of separation of powers. Anyway, Karl Popper's work on liberal politics, particularly the Open Society and its enemies, and a further edited volume of his papers after Open Society is really worth reading. But I'm going to be talking today mostly about his work in the logic of scientific discovery. So the idea that he puts forward there is this notion of falsification. So instead of confirming things, let's try to focus on falsifying them. So we set up a hypothesis, a claim about the world. Like if I drop an egg from a height and it lands on the floor, it's going to break. And then we might make certain hypotheses about why, because of gravity, because of physical forces and the brittleness of the shell of the egg, this kind of stuff. And then we could subject these hypotheses to rigorous tests. And the most rigorous test is generally an experimental one where we control for all sorts of factors except the ones that we think are particularly causal. And if our hypothesis survives these tests that are designed to falsify it, so the point of the experiment is not to prove that something is true, it's to prove that something is false. Right? If you try really hard to show that it's false and it still appears to be true, then we have good grounds to treat this hypothesis as a fact, not as truth, as a fact. There's a slight difference, and we'll explain that in the meantime. We treat it as a fact, which means that it's contingent on future evidence. So as long as the evidence continues to support our belief, we can treat it as a fact. Truth is not so contingent. Truth is just true. We build on the facts while we are continuing to try to falsify all our existing facts, and we can deduce hypotheses from our existing facts in the manner that I talked about on the deduction slide. So we start from these empirical observations, and then we make hypotheses that are coherent with those empirical observations that we then further test. Often falsification of this sort proceeds in chunks. So we get these kind of big paradigm shifts where we build on existing facts, build and build and build, and we seem to have this wonderful edifice that works in all these ways and seems broadly correct. And then weirdly, all of a sudden, new facts seem to emerge that seem to not be coherent with our existing paradigm. And eventually the weight of those facts gets too much for the paradigm to bear, and you need to shift to a new paradigm. The most famous example of that, I think, is Newtonian physics giving way to quantum mechanics. So Newtonian physics was super powerful, allowed us to do all sorts of things, particularly with cannons and stuff like that. But it didn't seem to explain a lot of atomic behavior, so behavior at the level of particles and that sort of thing. And quantum physics was a much better fit for that sort of stuff. In the policy context, I think there's been quite a big shift away from the idea that punishing people who commit crimes reduces the likelihood that they will commit crimes. And so the notion that prison should be a place that's extremely unpleasant because that will make you less likely to reoffend has sort of increasingly given way to a view that prison is a place where we need to rehabilitate people by addressing their mental health challenges, giving them skills, that sort of thing. All right, let's keep going with this idea of how the scientific method might turn up in public policy. So the idea is that we try to falsify things in public policy. One manifestation of that is fact-checking services and then news sources that kind of focus mostly on the facts. I've put the conversation here as an example of that, but I don't really think that's true. The conversation is a website written by academics where academics comment on the news. And often there is really good factual information in there, but the conversation really presents itself as though academics don't have an axe to grind, don't have an ideology, don't have values. And that's complete bullshit. And the conversation often publishes pieces by academics that are just academics' opinions on things with very little evidence or analysis or statistics or whatever you might want put in there. So I'd be very cautious around the conversation, but I do nonetheless think it is one of the better news sources going around. In terms of impact evaluation, what we really want to do is be designing policy proposals, particularly interventions, like discrete things that we're going to do, like this program to reduce recidivism in a prison. We want to design those in a way that is coherent with the existing facts. So like Liz Truss's budget, for example, I don't think was coherent with the facts about what we could expect taxation to do with growth. And then we want to test these policies that we implement. So this is what I really think evidence-based policy is. Evidence-based policy is about testing the things that we're doing and getting rid of the stuff that doesn't work. So we're falsifying the stuff that doesn't work. We're trying to be less wrong. The point of evaluation is to be less wrong, not to be more right. Okay? We're certainly not searching for universal objective truth. This is often a criticism that you get of the what works ideology from sociologists and anthropologists, and I think broadly these people don't know what they're talking about. All right, so how do we do this falsification in public policy? Well, this is where we get into the lecture content, so I just have one slide to remind you. So one of the main things we can do is experiments. This is a very robust test of a policy. We can do randomized control trials, quasi-experimental studies, that sort of thing. But we don't necessarily need an experiment to falsify, and I think this is one of the reasons why having this notion of a hierarchy of evidence and that we need RCTs to prove anything is wrong. We're not really trying to prove anything. We're trying to get rid of stuff that's not true. So for example, when people claim that poverty has only declined globally over the last 7 years because of the effect of China, it's trivial to show them this graph, which doesn't have anything to do with an experiment, but shows very clearly that poverty has gone down tremendously in China, but it has also gone down tremendously in the world at large when we exclude China. So here we are falsifying this claim that poverty reduction has only happened in China, and certainly falsifying the claim that poverty reduction requires China's particular mixed government market model. All right, so there's all sorts of ways that we can disprove things. All right, let's turn now to this example of cost-benefit analysis, commissioning, and impact evaluation. This is not an example that is particularly useful for your summatives because it's a very niche area of public policy, but I think it hopefully does illustrate all the different themes of the course, and then we will have an example a bit later that hopefully is more useful to your assignments. All right, so the WELLBY is a wellbeing-adjusted life year. It is a new proposal coming especially from a team at the London School of Economics with whom I am friends with, I guess. So Paul Frieders and especially Chris Krekel, who wrote this handbook here. Chris Krekel is a good friend of mine. He comes over all the time, but we have deep disagreements about how wellbeing policy making should go ahead, and you're going to hear about them today. I should say I think all of Chris's work is of a very high quality, so that's not the issue. But even at the high quality end, there's a lot of disagreements. I think well-being adjusted life years covers off on a lot of the themes of the last few lectures. So it covers off on impact evaluation, cost-benefit analysis, commissioning, and using particular outcome metrics. In this case, it's always life satisfaction. So the claim of WELLBYs advocates is that we should use life satisfaction as our main outcome measure, that we should commission policies that improve life satisfaction, that we should look to maximize life satisfaction for every dollar of public money spent, and that we should be evaluating policies on the basis of whether they increase life satisfaction or not. All right. Why would we use this WELLBY method? Well, we heard in the lecture that cost-benefit analysis, as is currently done using money and prices, has a lot of problems. One of the main ones is that many of the things we care about are not monetizable. So things like whether we have love in our lives and how valuable love is to us, social cohesion, the good life, so whether life is going well, this sort of thing. And it's not even really feasible in many cases to ask people how much they would be willing to pay for these things. Willingness to pay is a very common way to try to get at an evaluation of non-market goods, so things that aren't traded in markets. So things like biodiversity or love or whether your dad lives for another 5 years or something. Not things that are traded in markets, but all very important questions in a lot of policy applications, like whether to fund life-saving surgeries. How can we get to these things? Well, the advocates of WELLBYs think that life satisfaction is quite a useful concept and measure in this case, because life satisfaction is, in theory, all things considered. So when you make a judgment about how well your life is going, you think about all the things that matter to you. Different things matter to different people, but that doesn't matter. They do the weighting in their own head of which things are most important. They spit out a number, and then we can compare these numbers across people, or so the theory goes. So what do I mean by life satisfaction? Well, a common kind of form of this question is, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life on a scale from 0 to 10? These questions have been fielded in very large national and international surveys for several decades now, so we have a lot of data to work with. And I won't bash on this too much, but I don't actually think that this data is that valuable. You'll see why in a second. And I don't actually think that this research has produced very many interesting conclusions, certainly not conclusions. There's a lot of weird stuff going on in this data, but we don't actually quite know why. In any case, the appeal of life satisfaction in the context of cost-benefit analysis is that it's unidimensional, just like income. So all the things that people care about, we don't have to make trade-offs. We don't think, well, would you rather have a good knee or would you rather live in Kensington? We can just, in traditional cost-benefit analysis, look at the price of knee reconstructions and the price of houses in Kensington and do a comparison on the prices. In this case, we ask people, how satisfied are you with your life? And we compare people who have bad knees and people who live in Kensington, and we see whether there are differences between them. So people can consider whatever they think is valuable. This isn't entirely true in a lot of this research, because what usually happens is we never just ask people what determines your life satisfaction. We just take the number from them, the number that they give us, we put that on the left-hand side of a regression equation, and then we run the regression and we populate the right-hand side with things that researchers think cause life satisfaction. And I don't know why researchers think that they have such special insights, and I certainly don't think that we're respecting people in a democratic way here. To be democratic, we'd have to ask them what they think improves their life satisfaction. But supposedly people have too many cognitive and behavioral biases to give us a straight answer. I think that's bullshit, but I'll stop talking about it in such detail. All right. The second appeal of life satisfaction is that it's cardinal. What we mean by that is that 4 out of 10 is twice as much as 2 out of 10, the same way that $20 is twice as much as $10. So we're not just working with ordinal stuff here. It's not just that $20 is more than $10, it's that it's twice as much. So when we're thinking about distribution, who has how much in society and who deserves how much, it's very useful to have these kind of cardinal measures. It helps us make comparisons and helps us think about how much compensation people deserve. A further issue is that life satisfaction is arguably more proximate to well-being than income and prices, but remember that income and prices are treated as a proxy for preference satisfaction in economics. We're not trying to maximize people's income We're not trying to minimize prices. We're trying to help people to realize as many preferences as they can. All right. So a WELLBY, as I said, is a well-being adjusted life year. It's a very similar concept to a quality adjusted life year, which is a measure that's used in healthcare analysis. A WELLBY is a 1-point change in life satisfaction, so moving someone from a 5 to a 6 for one person for 1 year. In Treasury guidance about how to calculate a WELLBY, a single WELLBY is estimated to be valued at about £13,000, and we use it pretty much the same way we would use traditional cost-benefit analysis. So we would take the net present value of the WELLBYs and we would divide that by the net present value of the cost of generating those WELLBYs, and that would give us the cost effectiveness ratio. And then the idea is that you just fund the things that are the most cost effective for generating WELLBYs. All right. In order to do a WELLBY analysis, you need to understand the causal effect of an intervention on life satisfaction. So how do we do that? Well, we would run experiments. And the WELLBYs people, being almost all economists, are very committed to randomized controlled trials as kind of the only relevant evidence for cost-benefit analysis. The problem is that we have very few randomized controlled trials on life satisfaction. There are some studies showing that volunteering is good for your life satisfaction, but there are also a bunch of studies showing that it doesn't really seem to have any effect. There are studies showing that housing homeless people doesn't improve their life satisfaction, except that these programs weren't particularly well executed. The housing that was offered to people was very far away from their social networks, and so they often left the housing that they had to sleep on the street so that they could be close to their friends. It's not clear to me that we've really learned anything here about the effect of housing on life satisfaction. Certainly we haven't learned anything here about what sort of housing interventions we should be funding, just maybe not this one. And I don't think we've learned that through the effect on life satisfaction. So this is a kind of cautionary tale about how we should use our outcome metrics. In the case of migration, we have some evidence that migrating from Sierra Leone to Canada creates a huge increase in life satisfaction. But we also have evidence that migrating from Tonga to New Zealand creates no change in life satisfaction. So what's going on there? Well, I'll tell you in a moment what's going on there. But in any case, the things to emphasize here is that the results are quite heterogeneous. So it's not really clear whether the things that have an effect in one particular context have the same effect in another context. We just don't actually know a lot about what causes life satisfaction. And then finally, one thing that does seem to really improve life satisfaction is the improved access to psychological therapies program, which is run through the National Health Service in the UK. The problem here is that there's not really any external validity. It's not clear whether increasing the IAPT as it currently stands, which would basically make it more accessible to people with mild mental health conditions, would continue to have the gains that the IAPT currently has in being extended to people with a waiting list for these kind of conditions, or whether we should focus on people with much more complex mental health conditions, in which case the IAPT might not work as well as it does. It's also not the case that the NHS can be replicated as the NHS currently is in any other country, so it's not really clear what the external validity of this proposal is. But anyway, let's put all that aside for a moment. Here's the kind of argument for WELLBYs in a nutshell coming from Professor Baron Lord Richard Layard at the London School of Economics. He argues in this paper that his group, the Centre for Economic Performance, recently put out that rational government means spending our money to ensure the most well-being and the least possible misery. We now have the science to estimate benefit-cost ratios for most policies, and this should be the basis of the next spending review. I want to draw your attention here to the use of the word rational. And I'm going to critique that. So it's not really the idea, like WELLBYs has a lot of potential and there's places that we could use it. And I don't think that it's wrong to say that maximizing benefit cost is rational. I think it's more wrong to say that we have what it takes to maximize benefit cost and therefore doing this WELLBYs thing is rational. I think what I'm going to try to show you is that actually we are miles away from being able to do this sort of thing with either traditional cost-benefit analysis or QALYs or WELLBYs. And so applying these kind of methodologies in public policy exclusively is deeply irrational. Let's explore that a bit. Let's first talk about how we figure out a WELLBY. So the WELLBY does rely on the dollar value of a WELLBY. Where do we get that dollar value from, or the pound value in the case of the UK? So the Green Book guidance, which is the document that Treasury puts out that advises people on how they can how they can do particular business cases or particular cost benefit analyses, recommends a value of £13,000 per WELLBY. This is halfway between one methodology, which comes out at £10,000, and another methodology, which comes out at £6,000. The first methodology compares a WELLBY to a QALY, and it argues that one QALY is equivalent to a 7-point change in life satisfaction, so going from a 2 out of 10 to a 9 out of 10. Now, on the face of it, this to me is completely insane. We know of no intervention ever that has led to a 7-point increase in life satisfaction. That is absolutely like colossal. I don't know how these two things can be commensurate. But in any case, that's one place where it comes from. The other place where it comes from was a series of discrete choice experiments conducted by Daniel Fujiwara, where basically people are given a discrete choice experiment is a very common tool in economics where you give people many choices, but they're always head-to-head choices. So you're like, would you rather have an income of £100,000 or be married to the love of your life? Which one do you prefer? And then you pick one. And a series of these discrete choice experiments are done. You have a lot of these head-to-head conditions, and they'll just sort of vary one thing discretely. So the first time it'll be the love of your life for an income of £100,000. And then you'll answer a bunch of other questions, and then it'll swing back around and say the love of your life for £50,000. And then through these kind of experiments, we can start to calibrate how much things are worth to people. And this is basically how we approach a lot of willingness to pay problems. How willing to pay would you be to have a national park close by? Things like that. And we can get at these things with discrete choice experiments. Now, supposedly these discrete choice experiments suggested that the value of one point of life satisfaction for a year to the respondents in this experiment was £16,000. I don't think these respondents were a representative sample of the UK, but we can leave that problem aside. The bigger issue is that these discrete choice experiments only did comparisons between health, income, unemployment, relationships, and life satisfaction. So the whole idea that life satisfaction is a measure of all things considered is thrown out the window here. The only things that are considered are health, income, unemployment, and relationships. The second problem here is that discrete choice experiments are a measure of your preferences. Would you prefer health, income, unemployment, relationships, or life satisfaction? But remember that life satisfaction and preferences are two different notions of well-being. So is what makes someone's life go well that their life satisfaction is improving, or is what makes someone's life go well that their preferences are being satisfied? We can't blend those two together in this way. And I think this is a pretty straightforward case of the kind of philosophical superficiality of a lot of this work. And I don't think this is an unfair critique. The WELLBYs people are notoriously impatient with philosophical issues. And I wouldn't mind if they just put it to one side, acknowledging that they're impatient with it, or that they don't really want to get their hands dirty with it, or that's work for somebody else. But they're kind of dismissive of it. And then they often end up saying a bunch of stuff that is really philosophically incoherent and a bit embarrassing, frankly, rather than just engaging in more depth with this kind of work. Now, you might think that, well, one thing we could just do is look at the marginal impact of income on life satisfaction. So how much income does it take to increase someone's life satisfaction by a point? The problem is that despite being the thing that is most studied in the economics of happiness, we still don't know what that relationship is. And it's extremely unclear for reasons that I'll get into momentarily. Problem that you might be having, or that you might be thinking as well, okay, like I might be on board with WELLBYs, but like, can we trust these life satisfaction scales? Like, are these things a good way of measuring how satisfied people are with their lives? The short answer is like, kind of. So they're certainly psychometrically valid. What that means is that people who say that their lives are going well also tend to give higher numbers. People whose lives are, in a sense, objectively better, like their health is better, their income's better, they have more friends, they are achieving more of their goals in life. Those people tend to give higher numbers for their life satisfaction. And similarly, life satisfaction scales tend to be negatively correlated with things that we associate with ill-being. So people who are depressed, unemployed, lonely, this kind of stuff, they tend to give lower numbers for life satisfaction. So seemingly, it's all good. But I want to caution you So this is a bunch of my own research that we've been conducting for several years now. It started off as an adversarial collaboration, and I seem to have convinced the people who were in favor of life satisfaction that maybe it's not going to work so well. The basic problem is that there are two different things going on in life satisfaction reporting. On the one hand, you have to make an assessment of how your life is going. Then you have to map it into the scale. So imagine two people who have exactly the same life. They make exactly the same assessment of that life, but they have different reporting functions. So what that means is that they map it into a different category on the scale. So the person on the left here maps their actual life into a 6 out of 10. The person on the right here, living exactly the same life and assessing that life in the same way, maps it into an 8. Now you might think that's a bit fanciful, but it's quite analogous to something like a strict or generous grader. Let me just turn a light on in here because it's getting a bit dark. Oh, now I look like I'm on the surface of the sun. No, it's not too bad. All right. So you can imagine two teachers in a high school reading the same essay, assessing that essay the same way. So they might even say something like, this is in the top 10% of the class. They might agree on what's good about it. They might agree on what's bad about it, but they would still give it a different grade. So think about your university grades. We know that a first is above 70, but you'll have some lecturers who think that the highest mark that they're willing to give is 74. Then you'll have other lecturers who use the whole band all the way up to 100. And so they'll think, well, this is a first, but this is much better. So this thing over here, I'm going to give 88. So even though they are agreeing on the quality of the work, they are disagreeing on the grade to assign to that quality of work. That's what's going on here with life satisfaction reporting. Now, this is conjecture. This is like a concern that I have. What about the evidence for it? Let's first talk about some other concerns that I have. So one is ceiling effects. So if you have a look at this graph here, you can see that these red bars, these represent this person's life satisfaction scale. The black line represents their life satisfaction, their satisfaction with life. And we're measuring that, we're indexing it on the left-hand side on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, we have waves of an annual survey, like the British Household Panel Study. So in the first wave, the first year, this person's 7 out of 10. That's where they sit on their scale, and that's also what they're indexed to on the y-axis. Then their life gets a bit better, so they say they're 8 out of 10. Oh, gee, no problem. Then in the third year, their life gets better again. Now it's equivalent to 10 out of 10 on their original scale. But they don't want to say that they're totally satisfied with life. Now that their circumstances have improved, they can actually see further improvements that are possible in their life, and those improvements don't seem too fanciful, the way they may have seemed a bit fanciful at year 1. And so instead of saying that they're 10 out of 10 and adjusting their score, what they do is keep their score the same and adjust their scale. So the 8 out of 10 that they give in time 3 and the 8 out of 10 that they gave in time 2 are not comparable 8s. The second 8 is actually corresponding to a higher level of life satisfaction than the original 8. And we have this problem ongoing for the next few years. Their life just keeps getting better and better, and they keep saying that they're 8, right? And so we erroneously conclude that life is not improving for this person in their own assessment, when in fact it is. The reason why I got interested in this research is because this describes exactly how my life has gone. So I'm just always saying, yeah, I'm 9 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 9 out of 10, and my life just keeps getting better and better and better. I've listed some papers in here that show this empirically, that this is in fact a real phenomenon. We have also done a bunch of research recently where we are interviewing a diverse sample of UK residents, about 100 people to date, and we go through these long interviews with people for 45 minutes to an hour. We ask them a whole bunch of questions, and one of the main things that comes out of this interviews is that for most people, 8 out of 10 is the top of their scale. So a lot of people explicitly say that they would never give 10 out of 10, and that they could only see themselves saying that they're 9 out of 10 for a couple of days at a time around some major achievement or major good time event, like a wedding or something. The people that do give 10 out of 10 usually have quite modest lives in mind. And we see this in the big statistical data as well, that the people who are 10 out of 10 are often not as wealthy as people who are lower down the scale, have worse health, have a bunch of other outcomes that objectively seem worse, but they're still 10 out of 10. Now, there are some concerning implications of this for public policy analysis. So in the UK, according to the 2018 annual population survey, the average life satisfaction was 7.7 out of 10. So if we're thinking that we should measure social progress in terms of whether life satisfaction is going up, maybe we are already at the top. And so now, even though things that work for people, because of this ceiling effects problem, will be buried, we won't see the improvement, and so nothing will seem to work, when actually it's just that people are recalibrating their whole scale rather than their scale response. The second problem, and this is really big for impact evaluation, is that if I have two groups that I'm administering two separate treatments to, and one of the treatments is going into a group that has a low baseline life satisfaction, let's say 5 out of 10, they have room to improve. They will say that, oh yeah, this did help, now I'm a 7 out of 10. The other group, on the other hand, if they have a high baseline life satisfaction, like 8 out of 10, even if this intervention is as effective as the other intervention, it just won't show up in their scale responses because they don't have any room to move above that 8 out of 10. Next thing that we do is we show people in our interviews these different pictures of a scale. So in order for the basic statistical analysis of scales to work in the way that WELLBYs needs, people need to be using their scale in a linear fashion like this. What that basically means is that the same sort of magnitude of a change in their life will take them from a 4 to a 5 or from a 7 to an 8. It doesn't really matter where they are on the scale. The amount of satisfaction between points on the scale is the same. But you can see here that actually people's scales aren't linear in this way. This is actually a very rare way for people's scales to be. And the people who say that their scale is like this tend to be people who are in quite analytical professions like engineers and doctors. The majority of people say that they need small increments of satisfaction to move around their current level and larger increments to get further away from that level. And this makes a lot of sense given that you know what changes you need in your life for things to get a bit better or worse. But the other things that might give really big changes, they're a bit more uncertain to you. They're not really clear to you. You focus on what's closer to you. It's also very common to have just kind of quite uneven, small increments at the top and large increments at the bottom. So really big things need to happen to get people up to 7 out of 10, but then only kind of smaller things to get them up to 8, 9, and 10. So in any case, we don't have linearity as a very common way of answering, and we have all sorts of different ways of answering. So if we don't account for this difference in scale use, then our statistics are going to be highly biased, and we're going to get misleading estimates of the impact of certain interventions on life satisfaction. The final problem, the biggest problem, the one that I think is absolutely devastating for the idea that we would use life satisfaction analysis as for impact evaluation, is that major structural breaks in people's lives change the way that they use their scales. So I'll give you one qualitative example from our research. We had someone who was suffering from long COVID. We asked them, what was your life satisfaction before long COVID? They said, I was 8 out of 10. And we said, why were you 8 out of 10? They said, well, I was running half marathons on the regular. My PhD was going pretty well. Life was pretty good. They would have said that 9 out of 10 was improving on their personal best in the half marathon, and 10 out of 10 was submitting their PhD. I think you can already see that once they've submitted their PhD, the meaning of those points is going to change. So how comparable things are before and after the PhD is questionable. In any case, once they got the long COVID, we asked them, what's your life satisfaction? And they said, well, I'm 8 out of 10. And we're like, well, why is that? And they said, well, I've managed to recently return to walking the dog occasionally, and I can walk the dog for 20 minutes without getting completely short of breath and feeling like I'm going to die. And a 9 out of 10 would be being able to walk the dog up a hill, and a 10 out of 10 would be getting back to my PhD research. So they were back to working part-time, but they weren't back to doing their PhD. Now, a lot of life satisfaction scholars will look at these answers and think, oh, she must have adapted to COVID. She just got used to it. And now the 8 out of 10 really does confirm to the same level of life satisfaction as the 8 out of 10 before the long COVID. But this respondent explicitly rejected that view. So she said, and I quote, my scale is totally different because I would not have started from a point of extreme illness. There's a bunch of other kind of smoking gun quotes in this interview, but she's very explicit that long COVID has badly affected her life in all sorts of different ways. And she said, I'm a completely different person. Right? So these are not comparable responses. And so if we were trying to figure out the impact of long COVID on someone's life satisfaction, we couldn't just compare their life satisfaction before and after long COVID. If we were trying to understand the impact on life satisfaction of curing someone of long COVID, we probably similarly could not use their life satisfaction before and after the cure. And so at this point, I'm like, well, what are we trying to get out of these impact evaluations of life satisfaction? All right. So what's the upshot? Well, broadly, I would say that life satisfaction scales are a very noisy and inaccurate instrument. So the idea that we can get kind of precise causal estimates of the effect of certain policies on life satisfaction, I think is a bit of a fool's errand. And then if we don't have those precise causal estimates, the idea that cost-benefit analysis is going to be very precise and informative is also a bit of a pipe dream. That said, I think cost-benefit analysis with income and prices, as I argued in that Cambridge talk, is also just full of kind of fanciful assumptions upon fanciful assumptions. And so the numbers that we get out of traditional cost-benefit analysis are also in many cases basically illusory. They sort of appear to be rigorous and robust, appear to give us some traction on the problem, but actually we're basically just making it up as we go, at which point whether this is rational, I think is very questionable, and certainly whether this is a more kind of robust and rigorous way of doing things than some kind of substantial political process or relying on expert judgment or getting a lot of people together to do something democratic in terms of decision making. It's really questionable to me that this is more intellectual, more evidence-based or anything like that. It's not rational to base public policy decisions on wishful thinking masquerading as rigorous evidence. In fact, insisting on cost-benefit analysis when we know that cost-benefit analysis sucks for particular areas of policy is, I think, deeply irrational. We want to be realistic about what sorts of knowledge we can gain in a situation, what will give us traction on a problem, and try to rely on that wider epistemology. And I think this book by Ray Pawson, Evidence-Based Policy, A Realist Perspective, which comes out of the evaluation literature, is this much more sophisticated kind of approach. And I think this is also in very good alignment with a lot of contemporary cutting-edge philosophy of science, like the tangle of science notion from, I've forgotten her name right now, but she's like the main philosopher of science of the 20th century. I will be returning to these themes in the lecture on complex disadvantage, so I will talk to you then. But first, let's have a look at how I would go about finding an article or something to talk about on impact evaluation for my summatives. One moment. All right, so I've just booted up the internet and I want to try to do this live so that you see how I would go about it. Obviously, I am very practiced in this, so you will not have as easy a time of it as I will, but nonetheless, hopefully this is instructive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Project Syndicate and I'm just going to choose a policy challenge there, right? Sure. Okay. The Fed, Trump's trade scam. These are pretty macro. Climate turning point. Okay, well, let's take as a policy challenge decommodifying electricity, or rather this accelerate the green transition and the energy that's involved in that. So if I was studying this thing, right, if I was studying the energy transition, then I might think that one area where public policy thinks a lot about evaluation would be in cost-benefit analyses of these infrastructure projects. So you can see in the picture that we're looking at wind farms, we're looking at power cables, right? So that's infrastructure. So at this point, I might go to scholar.google. Hopefully I've typed that in properly. Okay, I've got to go through Google. Bing doesn't want me using Google. Go to Google Scholar. All right, notice that I did not go to artificial intelligence because artificial intelligence is not a search engine, all right? Now, I'm going to assume at this point that you've been reading around about the energy transition. So you've already got a handle on what might be going on. But I don't think you really need to do too much of that. We could type in something like cost benefit analysis, United Kingdom. Let's say I've narrowed myself to the United Kingdom, renewable energy policy, some other. All right. Now I might also want to put in since 2021. All right. Environmental benefit cost analysis, a comparative analysis between the United States and the United Kingdom. All right, that might be quite interesting. Just looking at differences in how these countries rely on policy, on cost benefit analysis in policy. All right, this looks interesting. So I could be curious for path dependencies. This one could also be really interesting. So then I go and read these things, right? Now, again, you don't need AI to generate you a summary because most articles already have an abstract, right? If you think the article is relevant, then just read the article, skim it, read it quickly, but do try to read the whole thing because that will give you more of a sense for all the different issues in play, all the different themes, and you'll start to make connections between documents, right? So they have a feed-in tariff in Italy, and you might want to think about whether that feed-in tariff is useful to the UK. This is a cost analysis of that feed-in tariff. This is maybe a little bit too complicated for me to talk about specifically in a cost-benefit analysis. So let's have a look at this one instead. The co-benefits of offshore wind under the UK Renewable Energy Obligation Scheme, integrating sustainability and energy policy evaluation. Energy policy is a very good journal. Very good, I don't know about very good, but it's a solid journal. Things that you read in here are reliable. All right, that's quite confusing. All right. Okay, so we have this conclusion here. The analysis supports a case for monetizing the wider co-benefits of energy technology implementation to support institutions and policymakers in the integration and evaluation of sustainability in energy policy. Now, here's where my wider reading might be relevant. So for one, from the lecture slides, you would have seen me talking about how there are a bunch of things that are difficult to incorporate into a cost-benefit analysis. Things like the traffic noise, the construction noise that happens when infrastructure is being built. How valuable is that to people? What's the monetary value of that? In this case, one of the things that is historically excluded from cost-benefit analysis, partially for technical reasons, partially for ideological reasons, is the co-benefits. So the co-benefits are the sort of non-market payoffs associated with particular projects, or the kind of multiplier effects that they have. So if I have local energy generation somewhere, then energy supply to manufacturers and other firms in that region might become cheaper. That might have various spillover effects on the economy there. There might be job creation, all sorts of things like that. And what these guys are trying to do is to develop a relatively straightforward way of estimating these co-benefits and then incorporating them into the cost-benefit analysis. So I could probably just talk about this paper, right? I could say that I could outline what those co-benefits are that have historically been not included in cost-benefit analysis, make the case for why they should be included in the cost-benefit analysis, cite this article as demonstrating how that could be done, and maybe in a sentence or two explaining how they do it in this article in the case of offshore wind co-benefits. And then I could have a sentence or two on the policy implications. So I'd need to do a bit of wider reading, but I could have a look at how, for example, hopefully this comes up if I search for it. Let's go to Google. Let's go offshore wind farm cancelled, United Kingdom cost. Yeah, so this was a very famous case where the Swedish utility company Vattenfall AB stopped the development of an onshore wind project in the UK in the midst of the Ukraine war crisis and the supply chain shocks that precipitated because their costs went up a lot. And what they were saying is that even though the UK government was subsidizing a lot of their activities, it still wasn't really worth it for them. And maybe you would want to combine that story with this one by saying, given that this co-benefits idea suggests that subsidies should be quite substantial for offshore renewable wind projects, it's possible that the government should have subsidized this Swedish project even more. So that's the way that you can draw connections between different articles that you've come across, write a sort of meaty paragraph about an issue in cost-benefit analysis in your particular policy challenge, build it out of a citation rather than out of your own thoughts. So we're going to ground the paragraph in this article in energy policy. We might be able to find an article about this, although it's quite recent, 2023. Let's find out. So if we go to scholar.google again, and then we type in Vattenfall cost subsidy United Kingdom wind. This looks quite interesting, contestation in wind farms, because this might talk to us about advocacy coalitions and the kind of politics of wind farms. Yeah, so we don't have particular reference to that that Swedish firm, but after Vattenfall, a science-based proposal to account for climate change in energy arbitrations. I think this is some other case. But in any case, I've already, by just Googling around a bit, seen maybe that there's not a direct link between these two, but that when I start to look at Vattenfall, all this other stuff about offshore wind comes up that might be quite relevant to my formative. So you don't want to read all these articles, right? I know that that's going to take too long, but go and have a look at the abstracts of things that you think is particularly relevant or might be useful for a paragraph that you haven't written yet, and skim read the articles, like read the topic sentences, cast your eyes over the paragraphs, that sort of thing, just so that your brain has material to work with to try to form those connections. All right. I hope this has been enlightening about how to apply this ex-ante evaluation theme to your summatives, and I will see you in the next lecture or bonus lecture.